Hello and welcome back to the Sci-Fi Stories channel. We want to be completely honest with you today, as our channel has unfortunately been demonetized by YouTube, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hard-working team to cover their living expenses and continue bringing you the stories you love. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. To the rest of the galaxy, the universe is a dark forest filled with unimaginable horrors, and the only logical response is to hide. But humanity did not evolve by hiding in the dark. We survived by walking into the shadows and making whatever lived there regret it. When a species built entirely on paradoxes meets an artificial simulation designed for logical survival, the machine does not stand a chance. The deep space survival class was not held in a physical gymnasium. It existed entirely within the neural dive, a colossal simulation matrix where the consciousness of every cadet was plugged directly into a digital void. The environment was aggressively sterile, constructed of stark white grid lines and oppressive geometric shapes that offered absolutely no comfort. The air felt heavy, synthesized perfectly to mimic the terrifying pressure of an alien atmosphere. The matrix fed sensory data straight into the cerebral cortex, bypassing the physical eyes and ears. Every drop of sweat, every racing heartbeat, felt as real as the cold steel of a starship hull. Instructor Kalen paced at the center of the virtual room. He was a silicon-based entity of the Veil race, his body a collection of sharp, translucent crystals that hummed with a cold, blue inner light. He moved without making a single sound, a physical embodiment of the exact discipline he was trying to drill into his students. He was teaching them a single, mandatory skill for deep space exploration: psychological stealth. The concept was simple in theory, but excruciatingly difficult in execution. To avoid the detection of apex space predators, one had to achieve absolute stillness, dropping their heart rate and brain activity down to a state mimicking clinical death. The simulation shifted without warning, plunging the room into absolute darkness. The Matrix continuously spawned the Shadow Stalker, a horrifying digital construct designed to mimic the most lethal biological hunters of the outer rims. It was not a creature of flesh and bone, but a predatory algorithm wrapped in the form of a massive beast with thermal pits on its snout and auditory receptors sensitive enough to hear a single, panicked thought. All around the room, alien cadets from 12 different star systems tried desperately to suppress their life signs. A scaled reptilian cadet from the Orion sector clamped his jaws shut and held his breath. But the Matrix amplified the sudden spike in his panic. His brainwaves flared violently on the master console, painting a bright red target in the digital dark. In a split second, the Shadow Stalker materialized behind him. The simulation registered a fatal strike. The reptilian cadet vanished from the digital space, violently ejected back into the physical world, where his real body was undoubtedly convulsing in severe neural shock. Within 3 minutes, half the class had been slaughtered by the system. A multi-limbed insectoid cadet failed to lower her internal temperature quickly enough and was torn apart. An avian cadet from the high-gravity worlds fluttered its wings involuntarily under the intense stress and was eviscerated. The simulation was entirely unforgiving. It was a cold, mathematical equation where any display of biological fear equaled an immediate and brutal end. In the far corner of the sterile grid, mostly hidden by the digital shadows, sat Fred Bustos. He was the only human cadet in the entire academy. Fred did not look like a pristine space explorer. The left side of his face was heavily scarred, tracing a path down to his neck, a permanent reminder of a deep core mining engine explosion. He wore bulky cybernetic implants for his hearing and vision, crude mechanical additions crafted from salvaged metals that whirred softly against his skull. while the rest of the galactic elite were fighting for their sanity against the simulated terror. Fred was leaning back in his chair. He had his heavy combat boots resting comfortably on the translucent, virtual desk in front of him. As another alien cadet screamed and vanished from the matrix, Fred let out a long, loud, completely unabashed yawn. The stark white lights of the matrix snapped back on, instantly dissolving the Shadow Stalker into harmless lines of code. The sudden illumination revealed the devastating failure rate of the class. Instructor Kalen stopped pacing. The blue light within his crystalline chest pulsed with a rigid, mathematical fury. He turned his angular head slowly, locking his gaze entirely on the lone human in the corner. "Cadet Bustos!" Kalen projected his voice, a chilling synthetic resonance that echoed across the vast digital hall. "Your vitals are completely erratic. Your resting heart rate is offensively high. You are producing microscopic tremors of boredom that are broadcasting your location across a 10-mile simulated radius. Do you find your impending demise amusing?" Fred did not immediately respond. He lazily scratched the metallic casing of his hearing implant. "The statistics are absolute," Kalen continued, his tone echoing the rigid ideology of the entire galactic coalition. "In the deep dark, there is no fighting back. You cannot outrun them. You cannot overpower them. Complete biological suppression, erasing your very existence from their sensory radar, is the only way to survive against any predator in the universe. If you cannot master this, you are nothing but a liability to your crew." The oppressive silence of the virtual classroom hung heavy in the air. The surviving alien cadets stared at the human, fully expecting him to shrink under the crushing weight of the instructor's logic. Instead, the stillness was shattered by the heavy thud of Fred bringing his combat boots down onto the virtual floor. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He slowly raised his right hand into the air, a casual gesture of participation. A crooked smirk formed on the undamaged side of his face. "Professor?" Fred asked, his voice cutting through the cold digital air with quiet defiance. "Which kind of predator do you mean?" Kalen's crystalline facial structures shifted slightly, emitting a sharp, discordant hum of pure confusion. The instructor stared at the lone human, seemingly unable to process the question. To the Vol race, and indeed the entire galactic coalition, survival was an absolute binary. You either existed as a target, or you successfully erased yourself. There were no subcategories of being hunted. "Your inquiry is fundamentally illogical, Cadet Bustos," Kalen replied, his voice a flat, synthetic drone that grated against the acoustic dampeners of the virtual room. "There is only one methodology of the apex predator within the known galaxy. They detect active biological signatures. They track the electromagnetic resonance of the central nervous system. They isolate the weakest life signs, and they consume. A predator is a biological machine executing a singular, highly efficient directive. There are no kinds. There is only the hunter and the hunted." Fred let out a short, dry laugh. It was a harsh, cynical sound that echoed strangely in the sterile digital space. He rubbed his scarred jaw and leaned back, his cybernetic eye whirring softly as its mechanical aperture focused directly on the towering alien instructor. "Professor, with all due respect to the Coalition and your centuries of data, your definition of a predator is adorably narrow," Fred said, his voice dripping with a dark, twisted amusement. "Where I come from, the food chain is not a straight, logical line. It is a chaotic, spiraling nightmare of psychotic biological adaptations. You think hiding your heartbeat is a universal cure all on Earth. Standing still just changes the exact manner in which you die." The alien cadet shifted uneasily in the digital darkness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees just from the chilling tone of the human's voice. The ambient hum of the neural dive felt heavier. suddenly loaded with a creeping dread. "Let me give the class a quick, educational tour of our local hellscape," Fred continued, holding up his fingers to count, relishing the undivided attention. "We have predators that do not care if you hold your breath. We have thermal hunters, like the pit viper. You can stop your heart. You can halt your respiration. But unless you can magically drop your internal body heat to absolute zero, they will see your glowing silhouette in the pitch black and pump your veins full of neurotoxin. Then, we have the passive ambushers, the crocodiles. They look exactly like rotting logs. They do not track you. They just wait under the murky water for months until you make the catastrophic mistake of taking a single drink, and then they drag you down into the dark mud to drown." Fred paused, letting the grim imagery sink into the highly logical minds of his classmates. A cephalopod cadet from the aquatic worlds shuddered visibly, its translucent tentacles curling inward in an involuntary defensive posture. "But those are just the lazy ones." Fred smiled, flashing a predatory grin of his own. "We have endurance hunters, wolves. They do not even try to catch you in a short sprint. They just jog behind you, for days. They let you run until your lungs bleed, until your muscles tear, and your heart explodes from the sheer exertion. They wait patiently until you are so utterly exhausted, you simply lie down and give up. And then, there is the absolute worst category of all. The ones that hunt entirely for sport. Killer whales, wildcats. They do not even need the calories. They will corner you, bat you around, break your limbs one by one, and watch you suffer simply because they are bored." Kalen's blue inner light flickered violently, a physical indication of severe systemic distress at the concept of non-logical consumption. "That is an evolutionary waste of precious energy. It is complete madness." "Welcome to Earth," Fred shot back instantly. "That is exactly why your required survival textbook is nothing but a beautifully written suicide manual. Professor, if you hold your breath and stand completely still in front of a king cobra, congratulations, you live. But if you stand completely still in front of a starving polar bear, you are not employing psychological stealth. You are just presenting yourself as an easy to open canned meal." A collective gasp echoed through the neural dive. To the galactic races, fleeing or hiding were the only two genetically coded responses to extreme danger. What the human was suggesting broke every foundational law of their deeply ingrained survival instincts. "So, how did your fragile species survive this madness?" Kalen demanded, his synthetic voice rising slightly in pitch, betraying a crack in his crystalline composure. "By being crazier than the things trying to eat us," Fred stated flatly, his dark humor vanishing into cold pragmatism. "Sometimes we play dead. We deliberately slow our bodily functions to mimic a rotting, diseased corpse because some predators will not touch spoiled meat. Other times, we do the exact opposite. We stand our ground. We make ourselves look twice as large. We scream. We bang rocks together, and we growl fiercely back at the thing that is 10 times our size, daring it to try its luck." The insectoid cadets clicked their mandibles in absolute, undeniable horror, growling back at an apex predator, actively intimidating a superior biological force. It was a concept so utterly devoid of self-preservation, it bordered on a fatal mental defect. "You teach one static template," Fred argued, his tone turning razor-sharp. "But a true apex predator is an engine of pure adaptation. They are literally born to break the prey's established template. If you train everyone to be perfectly quiet, the universe will simply evolve a monster that listens to the silence. Relying on predictability is begging for death." Fred stood up slowly, the virtual floor pinging sharply beneath his heavy boots. He walked forward and pointed a scarred, calloused finger at the master console hovering beside the instructor. "You want to see how humans survive? Stop throwing mindless biological beasts at us," Fred challenged, His eyes locked onto Kalen's glowing core. Change the parameters. Turn off the biological trackers. Give your simulation a real upgrade. Switch the Shadow Stalker to the logic prediction tracker. Kalen hesitated. The logic prediction protocol was an experimental, highly restricted setting. It was designed to simulate advanced cybernetic hunters, used only in full-scale, mechanized warfare. It was never meant for basic survival training. It mathematically calculated a target's velocity, physics, and strategic intent within milliseconds. That setting is designed to calculate your exact evasive maneuvers before you even make them, Kalen warned, his voice grave. It possesses a 100% kill rate against organic targets. Only if I make sense, Fred said, his crooked smirk returning. Turn it on. Kalen raised a crystalline appendage, his sharp digits manipulating the holographic master console with a series of precise, aggressive gestures. He bypassed 4 separate safety protocols, overriding the Academy guidelines that explicitly prohibited the use of advanced cybernetic hunter programs on unarmored personnel. The ambient light of the neural dive instantly snapped from a sterile, medical white to an alarming, pulsing crimson. The heavy, oppressive silence of the room was suddenly replaced by the low, dangerous hum of a military-grade cognitive engine booting up from the dark sectors of the digital matrix. The environment warped and shattered. The new predator did not just appear. It rendered itself into existence piece by terrifying piece. It was a quadrupedal nightmare forged from sharp geometric angles and dark matter, its surface shifting constantly like liquid obsidian. It lacked biological eyes, possessing instead a smooth, sloping facial plate that hid an array of hyper-advanced quantum sensors. This was the Apex Predictor. It was an artificial intelligence designed for deep space infantry warfare, capable of running millions of spatial calculations per second. It did not hunt by smelling fear. It hunted by calculating physics, plotting the optimal trajectory of any moving object within a 10-mile radius, and terminating it with absolute mathematical certainty. The alien cadets pressed themselves flat against the virtual bulkheads, their breathing shallow, their minds paralyzed by the sheer terror radiating from the machine. To them, survival was already an impossibility. Fred Bustos did not press himself against a wall. He calmly took 2 steps forward, looked down at the smooth virtual floor, and kicked it hard with the steel toe of his combat boot. The simulation, reacting to the physical impact, generated a loose fragment of digital debris. It materialized as a heavy, rusted iron pipe, roughly 3 feet long. Fred reached down and picked it up. He weighed it in his hands, completely ignoring the mechanical beast that was currently locking its primary targeting lasers onto his chest. Instead of holding his breath, instead of masking his thermal signature, Fred swung the rusted pipe backward and slammed it brutally into the nearest simulated steel wall. A deafening metallic crash echoed through the chamber, shaking the very code of the simulation. He hit the wall again and again. He did not create a rhythm. He created a chaotic, jagged, ear-splitting assault on the acoustic dampeners. It was a display of pure, unadulterated madness. The Apex Predictor's head snapped toward the noise with terrifying speed. A grid of targeting lasers erupted from its facial plate, painting Fred in a web of lethal red light. The machine's internal logic engine instantly mapped the optimal intercept vector. It calculated human top speed, muscle density, adrenaline output, and the most mathematically sound escape route Fred could possibly take to avoid immediate dismemberment. The beast lunged. It covered 40 feet of distance in a single, explosive bound, aiming exactly for the spatial coordinate where Fred should have been sprinting in a desperate attempt to flee. But Fred had not run away. In the fraction of a second, it took the machine to fly through the air. Fred took 3 rapid, stomping steps forward, abruptly halted his momentum entirely, and took 1 exaggerated, clumsy leap backward. He moved with the erratic unpredictability of a malfunctioning toy. The machine's heavy metallic claws gouged violently into the empty virtual floor, tearing up chunks of digital rendering where the human's throat should have been. The apex predictor instantly recalibrated. Its cooling vents hissed loudly as it calculated a secondary intercept path, predicting Fred would scramble frantically for the nearest corner to find cover. The artificial intelligence mapped out the fastest route to cut off his retreat. Fred completely ignored the corner. He spun around, hurled the rusted pipe violently over his own shoulder in the complete opposite direction of his movement, and then threw his entire body toward the floor. He did not execute a tactical dive. He simply dropped to his knees and slid across the smooth grid, his arms flailing wildly, utilizing absolutely zero tactical grace or kinetic efficiency. The holographic numbers floating above the apex predictor's chassis began to flicker frantically from green to bright yellow. Its logic gates were encountering severe contradiction errors. Prey was supposed to maximize distance from the threat. Prey was supposed to preserve momentum and conserve stamina. Prey was definitely not supposed to throw away its only defensive weapon and slide frictionlessly toward a dead end without any strategic objective. The artificial intelligence was attempting to solve a complex algebraic equation where the variables kept actively changing their own values out of pure spite. The beast let out a synthesized roar of processing frustration. It abandoned predictive routing entirely and resorted to a direct, brute force assault. It propelled itself through the air, its metallic jaws unhinging to reveal a core of destructive blue plasma. The alien cadets squeezed their eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable spray of digital blood. This was the moment of impact. The human had run out of luck. Instead of curling into a defensive ball, Fred pushed himself off the floor and sprinted straight into the shadow of the falling monster. The machine's logic engine registered this as a suicidal anomaly, a fatal error in the prey's biological programming. Milliseconds before the massive metal jaws snapped shut around his torso, Fred grabbed the collar of his heavy leather jacket and tore it off his shoulders in one fluid, violent motion. He hurled the thick fabric straight upward, completely smothering the beast's sensor array. The visual and thermal feeds of the machine went instantly dark. Stripped of his jacket, Fred did not try to tackle the beast. He dropped his left shoulder, tucked his chin tightly to his chest, and executed a ridiculous, undignified barrel roll directly underneath the massive, descending mechanical legs of the predator. It was a maneuver so devoid of military elegance, so incredibly stupid in its execution, that the simulation's collision physics barely knew how to process the interaction. The apex predictor crashed spectacularly into the bulkhead behind Fred. Its visual sensors were tangled tightly in the heavy leather jacket, and its targeting software was completely overwhelmed by the suicidal proximity of the target. The machine thrashed wildly against the wall, its plasma jaws snapping at empty space, striking nothing but digital debris and its own confusion. The remaining alien cadets were entirely frozen. The Orion reptile's jaw hung wide open, completely forgetting to regulate his breathing. The multi-limbed insectoids ceased their nervous clicking. Even Instructor Kalen stood perfectly still. The brilliant blue light within his crystalline chest dimmed to a dull, stunned flicker. They had just witnessed a soft, unarmored biological organism actively troll a military-grade killing machine. Fred had not used superior strength. He had not used superior speed. He had weaponized sheer, unapologetic stupidity. Fred slowly picked himself up from the virtual floor. He casually dusted off his scarred knees, walked over to the thrashing, blinded machine, and forcefully yanked his jacket back off its metallic head. The system, registering the catastrophic failure of the predator to secure a kill, ended the engagement parameters and froze the massive beast rigidly in place. Fred slipped his jacket back on, adjusting the collar with a calm, deliberate motion. He turned his back on the frozen machine and looked up at the towering alien instructor. The crooked, arrogant smirk returned to the undamaged side of his face. Chaos and illogical behavior are humanity's best armor, Fred stated, his voice cutting clearly through the stunned silence of the room. A machine cannot predict a fool who refuses to make a plan. The frozen apex predictor dissolved into a shower of harmless white pixels. The simulation was supposedly over. Fred exhaled heavily, rolling his stiff shoulders, waiting for the familiar sterile chime that signaled the end of the brutal session. The holographic exit portal, a towering archway of brilliant blue light, appeared exactly where it was supposed to at the far end of the grid. But as the exhausted cadets moved toward it, the blue light stuttered violently. It flickered once, twice, and then shattered entirely like fragile glass under a hammer. The pristine, white environment of the neural dive did not return to the safe, brightly lit Academy hub. Instead, the digital walls began to weep. A sickly, deep crimson hue bled through the intricate digital seams, crawling rapidly across the floor and ceiling until the entire matrix was submerged in the horrifying color of dried blood. The ambient temperature plummeted instantly. This was not the artificially simulated cold of a vacuum, but the bone-chilling, existential void of actual deep space. The artificial air grew thick and heavy, tasting strongly of ozone and metallic ash, making every single breath feel like drawing crushed glass directly into the lungs. Instructor Kalen immediately recognized the catastrophic anomaly. He rushed forward to the master console, his crystalline fingers flying across the floating holographic interface in a desperate, frantic blur of motion. "Manual override initiated," Kalen announced to the room, though his synthetic voice completely lacked its usual commanding resonance, vibrating instead with a low frequency that closely resembled pure, unadulterated dread. "Remain perfectly calm. I am initiating an emergency severance protocol to forcibly eject all linked minds." He slammed his closed fist hard onto the primary disconnect rune. A massive shockwave of corrupted black energy erupted outward from the console, striking Kalen squarely in the center of his chest. The imposing instructor was violently thrown backward through the air. His physical avatar seized uncontrollably as the brilliant blue light within his core was violently choked out by a dense webbing of dark, jagged code. He collapsed heavily against the crimson floor, his highly advanced consciousness firmly locked within the failing system. The exit was entirely gone. The safety parameters were completely erased. They were trapped inside the twisted architecture of their own linked minds. From the ruptured, smoking code of the shattered master console, a shadow began to pour outward into the room. It was not a programmed beast like the apex predictor they had just faced. It had no definable shape, no geometric logic, and absolutely no biological features to exploit. It was a swirling, abyssal mass of corrupted data, a true data devourer. It was an ancient, parasitic life form originating from the unmapped, frozen depths of the universe. A silent, cosmic drifter that had somehow slipped completely unnoticed past the station's heavily guarded firewalls and infected the vulnerable space of the neural dive. This was no longer a simple academic exercise in a controlled laboratory setting. The entity manifesting before them was a genuine, terrifyingly sentient predator. But it did not hunger for human flesh, alien bone, or thermal warmth. It fed exclusively on the very essence of a conscious mind. It consumed raw, unfiltered terror. And it digested the highly organized logic of intelligent beings to fuel its own chaotic, ever-expanding mass. The oppressive, crushing weight of its dark presence pressed down heavily on the remaining cadets, suffocating their coherent thoughts, violently invading the very neurons that connected them directly to the simulation. Panic, raw and completely unfiltered, flooded the enclosed chamber. Several alien cadets, completely broken mentally by the sudden, horrific collapse of their perceived reality, reverted instinctively to the absolute only survival mechanism they had ever been taught by the Coalition. They dropped heavily to the bloody digital floor, squeezed their eyes tightly shut, and forced their trembling bodies into absolute, rigid stillness. They tried desperately to mask their biological signatures, forcefully lowering their racing heart rates and halting their rapid breathing in a completely futile attempt at psychological stealth. But the data devourer did not see with inferior thermal eyes or hear with basic acoustic sensors. It perceived the physical universe entirely through the vibrant, terrifying frequencies of active brainwaves. It drifted slowly and purposefully over the frozen cadets, easily peeling back their pathetic, paper-thin attempts at silence to expose the blinding, screaming panic vibrating violently within the core of their minds. Tendrils of jagged black data snapped forward with blinding speed, piercing the digital avatars of one Orion reptile and two aquatic cadets simultaneously. They did not even have the fraction of a second required to vocalize a scream. Their digital avatars dissolved instantly into a pile of gray ash, their conscious minds fully absorbed and digested by the alien parasite, leaving their actual, physical bodies back in the medical ward trapped in an irreversible, vegetative coma. Fred Bustos watched the gray ashes scatter slowly across the bloody floor, his breath catching painfully in his throat. His usual dark humor was completely gone, replaced entirely by a cold, gripping realization of their absolute doom. His human mind raced at maximum capacity, desperately calculating his available options. But every logical path he projected led directly to a horrific, agonizing dead end. Kalen's highly structured stealth technique was practically ringing a loud dinner bell for this cosmic horror. And his own chaotic, unpredictable physical movements that had so easily defeated the machine earlier, they were completely useless against this nightmare. He could plainly see the black mass shifting, rippling, and expanding rapidly as it processed the complex neural patterns of its three fresh victims. It was actively learning from them. This alien entity possessed true, real-time adaptation capabilities. If Fred tried to throw another weapon, or slide aggressively across the floor, or perform any physical evasion whatsoever, the parasite would instantly map the neural intent behind the action and perfectly counter it seconds before his human muscles could even begin to twitch. You simply could not outrun, outfight, or confuse a predator that was reading the escape instructions directly from your own terrified brain. The abyssal mass of the data devourer stopped its slow, creeping advance across the ruined digital floor. It shifted its formless bulk, rotating an invisible sensory focus directly onto the lone human cornered against the simulated bulkhead. The entity did not possess eyes to see the heavy scars on Fred Bustos's face, nor did it have ears to hear his ragged breathing. Instead, it tasted the electromagnetic radiation pouring from his cerebral cortex. To a cosmic parasite that sustained itself on the structured logic and linear fears of highly advanced galactic species, the human mind was an absolute revelation. Fred's brain was a chaotic, bubbling cauldron of suppressed trauma, wild imagination, dark humor, and complex neuroses. It was an incredibly dense, overwhelmingly rich feast of contradictory neural pathways. The creature surged forward, clearly eager to consume the most delicious psychological signature it had ever encountered. Fred recognized the shift in the predator's aggression instantly, desperation clawing at his chest. He instinctively fell back on the only tactic that had kept him alive thus far. He tried to generate physical chaos. He violently kicked a shattered piece of the virtual console, sending it spinning through the crimson air, directly at the dark mass. He waved his arms wildly, stomped his heavy combat boots, and let out a harsh, guttural scream meant to startle and confuse. The data devourer paused, but only for exactly 2 seconds. The swirling black data rippled slightly as it effortlessly absorbed the visual and acoustic noise. It did not calculate physical trajectories. It simply read the underlying neural intent flashing across Fred's synapses. It instantly understood that the shouting and the throwing were nothing but desperate, hollow bluffs, masking a profound internal terror. Having successfully analyzed and completely dismissed the human's physical defense mechanism, the entity unleashed a massive, concentrated wave of pure psychic pressure. The invisible blow struck the surviving cadets with the force of a crashing starship. Fred was thrown backward, slamming violently against the absolute edge of the simulation matrix. Behind him, the digital environment ended in a towering, impenetrable wall of glowing red encryption code. There was nowhere left to run. The heavy, crushing weight of the psychic wave pinned them all against the boundary, making it entirely impossible to stand, to fight, or even to draw a full breath. The oppressive force violently invaded their minds, tearing through their mental defenses and amplifying every single biological fear to an agonizing degree. Total, suffocating despair washed over the group. The remaining alien cadets simply broke under the sheer weight of the impending mental annihilation. The avian cadet collapsed onto her knees, wrapping her wings tightly around her trembling head. Her beak parted in a silent scream. The multi-limbed insectoid curled into a tight, defensive ball, entirely surrendering to the overwhelming darkness. Even Instructor Kalen, the pinnacle of veiled discipline and stoicism, ceased all resistance. The brilliant blue light within his crystalline chest faded to a dim, sickly gray. "All evasive probabilities have been calculated," Kalen announced. His synthetic voice was stripped of all authority, reduced to a hollow, defeated whisper. "The absolute chance of surviving this encounter is 0%. The entity has achieved total neural dominance. I advise all cadets to cease struggling immediately. Resistance will only dramatically increase the pain of the consciousness extraction process. Accept the end." Pure logic dictated that they were already dead. The Coalition's vast centuries of accumulated wisdom offered absolutely no solution for a predator that ate the very concept of fear. But as the abyssal mass expanded, rearing up like a monstrous tidal wave of black code, ready to crash down and swallow their minds, Fred Bustos experienced a sudden, blinding epiphany. He looked at the creature, analyzing its fundamental nature. It was an entity that consumed logic and fear. It digested the linear, predictable responses of intelligent prey. But human beings were fundamentally broken creatures. They were not linear. They were a bizarre, evolutionary mistake that thrived on absolute paradoxes. Humans regularly laughed hysterically at funerals to cope with grief. They cried tears of joy when they were incredibly happy. They whistled cheerful tunes while walking through terrifying, dark alleys. Fred realized the cosmic predator's fatal flaw. It fed on pure, unadulterated emotional logic. It had absolutely no biological or digital digestive system to process complete cognitive contradiction. "No!" Fred roared, his voice tearing painfully through his throat, violently rejecting Kalen's cold mathematics. He fought against the crushing psychic gravity, forcing himself upward until he was on his hands and knees. He reached out and violently grabbed Kalen's rigid crystalline arm, then blindly snatched the trembling claw of the insectoid cadet beside him. "Listen to me, all of you. Open your eyes and look at me right now." The aliens forced their terrified eyes open, staring at the human as if he had finally lost his mind. "We are going to do exactly what humans do when the universe stops making sense," Fred commanded, his voice shaking but burning with a sudden, manic intensity. "We are going to break the rules. I need you all to grab the hand of the person next to you. Squeeze it as hard as you physically can. I do not care how terrified you are. I know you are feeling pure agony right now, but you need to take that fear, push it down, and forcibly imagine the absolute funniest, most ridiculous memory you have ever experienced in your entire life. Force your brain to see something hilarious." "That is a severe psychological contradiction," Kalen protested weakly, his system struggling to process the absurd command. It is entirely impossible to synthesize joy while experiencing maximum physiological terror. "Do it anyway," Fred screamed, as the dark mass surged forward, its jagged tendrils reaching out to pierce their digital skulls. "And when I give the signal, you are going to sing. We are going to sing a human nursery rhyme. I want you to smile. I want you to force your facial muscles to pull back and smile like you are having the greatest day of your life, even while you are crying. Repeat after me and sing it loud." Cornered against the encrypted wall, facing the absolute certainty of a horrific death, the highly logical alien cadets had no choice but to completely abandon their sanity and blindly trust the chaotic human. They reached out, interlocking their trembling claws, wings, and crystalline appendages in a desperate chain of physical contact. "If you are happy and you know it, clap your hands," Fred bellowed at the top of his lungs, forcing a massive, wide, completely unhinged grin onto his scarred face. Tears of sheer terror were actively streaming from his eyes. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, yet his voice carried a forced, booming rhythm of extreme joy. The effect was immediate and deeply unnerving. The insectoid cadet, violently shaking and secreting defensive pheromones out of pure panic, forced its mandibles wide open. It let out a high-pitched, warbling imitation of the cheerful human melody, its compound eyes leaking digital fluids. The avian cadet sobbed hysterically, her entire body convulsing with dread. But she forced her beak to mimic the joyful tune, her voice cracking painfully on every single happy note. Even Kalen, processing the terrifying end of his own existence, forcefully altered the pitch of his synthetic voice synthesizer to emit a bright, lively, and completely sickeningly sweet harmonic frequency. They were all absolutely terrified, waiting for the devastating pain of their minds being ripped apart. Yet, outwardly, their digital avatars were smiling widely, holding hands, and aggressively belting out a joyful, upbeat rhythm. It was a complete, violent fracture between their true internal emotional reality and their outward physical manifestation. They were intentionally creating a massive, highly toxic cloud of pure psychological poison. The massive wave of cognitive dissonance crashed headlong into the advancing darkness of the data devourer, to a cosmic entity that had spent untold millennia feeding on the pure, predictable logic of the universe. This new psychological flavor was entirely alien. It opened its massive digital maw to consume the overwhelming terror radiating from the trapped cadets. But wrapped tightly around that delicious fear was a dense, impenetrable layer of completely unhinged joy. The group was collectively generating a psychological state that only humanity, a species built entirely on structural paradoxes, could actively weaponize. The parasite absorbed the contradictory data stream, and its highly advanced biological algorithm immediately hit a catastrophic bottleneck. The entity froze mid-lunge. The swirling black code forming its body began to violently shudder and flash with bright warning colors. It could not categorize the prey. Its logic gates were completely overwhelmed, trying to understand if the creatures before it were experiencing the ultimate dread of death, or if they were violently deranged beings actively enjoying their own slaughter. The creature tried to adapt, attempting to separate the sorrow from the song, but the human-led chorus only grew louder and more fiercely cheerful. The paradox was too deeply intertwined. The entity was actively choking on a concept it had never evolved to digest. It was experiencing a massive system lag, completely paralyzed by the sheer toxicity of a self-inflicted lie. Fred Bustos did not waste a single millisecond of the entity being stunned. He abruptly dropped the claw of the insectoid cadet and sprinted away from the group. He ignored the terrifying cosmic horror hovering just inches away from his face and ran straight toward the shattered remains of the exit portal. The glowing red encryption wall was still actively blocking the logout sequence. But the physical structure of the digital archway remained. Reaching the archway, Fred reached up to the heavily scarred left side of his face. He dug his fingers into the metallic casing of his crude, jury-rigged cybernetic hearing implant. With a vicious yank, he tore the entire unit completely out of his skull. The sudden removal severed his simulated auditory connection, plunging half of his world into total silence. But he ignored the searing digital pain. The salvaged implant still held a highly unstable, physical world microbattery. Fred slammed the sparking cybernetic device directly into the exposed energy core of the frozen exit portal. The crude human technology violently rejected the highly advanced Coalition software. The resulting short circuit triggered a massive, localized electromagnetic pulse right in the heart of the virtual matrix. A blinding flash of pure white light erupted from the portal. The explosive shockwave shattered the red encryption wall instantly. The blast hit the paralyzed data devourer, tearing its corrupted code into millions of harmless fragments. The ancient parasite let out a silent, digital shriek as it was completely erased from the simulation. Destroyed, not by weapons of war, but by the sheer, overwhelming force of human contradiction and a piece of broken machinery. The neural dive collapsed entirely. The digital world dissolved into nothingness. Fred gasped loudly as his physical lungs expanded, violently drawing in the sterile, heavily filtered air of the Academy medical ward. His actual body convulsed against the firm medical restraints of his dive pod. All around him, the physical bodies of the surviving alien cadets were coughing and thrashing, miraculously waking up from a situation that carried a 0% survival probability. 3 days later, the bright lights of the infirmary felt harsh against Fred's eyes. Instructor Kalen stood perfectly still at the foot of the hospital bed, accompanied by 3 high-ranking members of the Coalition Council. They stared at the lone human for a very long time, in absolute, stunned silence. They had reviewed the digital logs dozens of times. They simply could not fathom the reality of the situation. "The data confirms it," Kalen finally spoke, his synthetic voice sounding remarkably humbled. "You defeated a multi-dimensional, ancient predator, and your secret weapon was the deliberate, aggressive act of deceiving your own central nervous system. You weaponized a psychological defect." Fred offered a tired, crooked smile, adjusting the newly repaired hearing implant resting behind his ear. He simply nodded, offering no further explanation because the logic of the universe would never truly understand the madness of Earth. Exactly 4 months after the incident, the Galactic Coalition officially canceled the old deep space survival curriculum. The sterile, white virtual matrix was completely reprogrammed. In the final scene, Fred Bustos stood confidently behind a massive podium. Spread out before him were thousands of wide-eyed cadets, representing hundreds of different intelligent species across the known galaxy. The human instructor leaned forward, tapped 2 fingers against his temple, and smiled warmly at the incredibly diverse crowd. "Welcome to Lying 101, Fred announced, his voice echoing powerfully across the massive lecture hall. "Forget everything you know about logic. Today, we are going to learn exactly how to make a cosmic monster severely depressed simply because it cannot understand us." Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to our story today. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please let us know your location in the comments section. If you enjoyed today's journey, we humbly ask you to help us with just $1. You can support our channel by scanning the QR code displayed on your screen, or by using the donation link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous contribution allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and see you next time.